elements or characters or any kind of standout aspects of Men of Winter where you can like specifically remember that this element or this character turned out to be much more than what you thought it was going to be, or even less than you thought it was going to be?
Well, yeah, absolutely. When Hector gets to this Ilascova, which is the last sort of city or bastion of civilization before you actually get to the war front, he needs a place to stay, just logically. So he finds a boarding house, and the boarding house has, this married couple who own it and operate it. And excuse me, when I originally introduced them to the story, it was mainly just to logically have some place for him to stay, and if he's going to stay in a boarding house, which makes sense, there's going to be some operators. Well, then, as it turns out, they end up becoming fairly important characters in the course of the novel. Not crucial to it necessarily, but they definitely are in it again and again and again. And then there's a little sort of side plot that involves them, and none of that I really saw coming when I first introduced them into the plot. And by the same token, there are a couple of other characters who I initially introduced just because they filled some sort of narrative need at the moment, but then they ended up having more importance in the course of the story, both in terms of advancing the plot, but then in some cases I think taking on even some metaphorical import and adding to some layers of that sort of thing going on. Again, that's kind of part of that organic process where I don't necessarily know who's going to turn out to be important and who isn't. I know some of the readings I've done, I've done chapter 5. It just is a chapter that seems to work well in terms of being fairly standalone, so an audience hearing it can kind of get a sense of the novel, but also get a little brief, sort of narrative that has its own beginning, middle, and end. And in that chapter 5 that I read, there's a female character introduced, and I know in retrospect or talking to people afterwards, some people who haven't read the novel, they assume that female character is going to grow into becoming a really important part of the story, and in fact, she's mentioned there, and then that's it. So and I didn't necessarily plan that. It just, I introduced her. She worked for that particular chapter, and then for whatever reason, I didn't come back to her to do anything else in the course of the novel. So yeah, again, very very organic in terms of who becomes important and who doesn't.
We spent a lot of time in the boarding house, not necessarily expected, but we spent a lot of time with these characters, with the owner and his wife, and just kind of the I guess tenants, the visitors, and it seems to be sort of the location where we really get to see Helena shine. She has this almost magical effect on all of the residents of the boarding house, the owner and those staying there. We see the owner and his wife who are constantly fighting, kind of, overcome it all and, grow more fond of each other, like in their early days, even expect a child, while Helena...
Spoiler alert.
Yeah,
yeah. It's okay.
I deliberated.
Right, I can see that, yeah.
And just the, all the visitors to the boarding house who were, otherwise just kind of people on their own missions passing in the night, almost literally, come to enjoy each other's company and become this sort of de facto family almost over the course of the novel. And I would say some of it almost seems like by magic. It seems like this is just sort of an effect that Helena has on anybody and everybody near her everywhere that she goes. And it strikes me there are other hints of some sort of supernatural aspect to her as a character, electric eyes, things like this. Is that something that you were hoping to go for? Is there something divine about Helena, or is there something...
Well, right. Again, the whole idea of the Odyssey being sort of the underpinning of this whole thing. Obviously, in Homer's work, you do have human characters, and then you have divine characters, gods and goddesses who interact with the characters. So I wanted to sort of bring out that idea, but again, without necessarily pinning it down and saying this is definitely, a god or a goddess or whatever, but to give, some characters these sort of seemingly divine powers or whatever. And so it's not quite clear if Helena has some sort of divinity, or if she's just a very charismatic, sort of character, and so I try to kind of give hints of both, and then there are other characters who sort of fall into that, maybe human, maybe divine, maybe we're not quite sure sort of thing, and it really was a kind of a balancing act, to really try to pull off there, because I didn't want to go too far into that aspect and just make it a book about these sort of supernatural characters, but I wanted there to be enough of a hint that we kind of wonder, if that's part of what's going on, or if it's just maybe Hector has become so enamored and he's our first person narrator that maybe he's so enamored that he attributes things to her that aren't even necessarily true, or whatever. But yeah, playing definitely with that idea of having an almost sort of superhuman quality about her, both, as you said, in terms of her charismatic qualities, but also she just seems to be able to handle almost any situation that she finds herself in. And I'm really drawn to strong female characters in stories that I read. Like, for example, right now in my class that I'm teaching, we're reading Jane Eyre, and there's a good example of a strong female character. And I'm again tend to be drawn towards those as a reader, and I like to teach narratives with those, and so I guess it's natural that I would create such a character in my own fiction. So she definitely has that going on as well. But again, is that because of some sort of divinity? Is there strength rooted in that, or again, is she just really intelligent and really crafty and just really knows how to handle all kinds of different situations? And it's just not quite clear in the novel, deliberately so.
Your upcoming novel or novella, Weeping
Right.
with an Ancient God, is due out in August.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Right, it's actually a novella, which is Weeping with an Ancient God, and then there's actually just some collected stories, because the novella obviously isn't super long. It's 100 and some pages, and who knows what that'll translate to print-wise, probably something like that. And then I've got a dozen short stories which have been published in various places, and I'm putting with that. But the actual novella it's kind of revisionist fiction in a sense too, but it's really focused on the author Herman Melville, who everyone associates with Moby Dick, about when he was a young man, he went on this whaling adventure and then ended up jumping ship, he and a companion. This is July 1842, and actually spent about a month or so with actual cannibals in the Marquesas Islands, and then he ended up, when he finally got back to the United States, which was like 2 years later, he ended up writing up that adventure in his own kind of highly autobiographical novel, Typee. And I remember seeing a documentary about Herman Melville and talking about his experience with these cannibals and then writing Typee. And I just got this idea that, gosh, that could be, if done properly, a really interesting story in itself. And so in a sense, my novella is a sort of revisionist of Typee, in the sense that it's a retelling of Melville's own story. But I did research Melville's biography, and so I've tried to keep the facts legitimate in terms of his actual biography and his experiences on board the ship, and some of the issues that he was dealing with as a human being or whatever. And so that's what the novella focuses on. I try to not have it be so closely linked to Melville's own story, and so one of the ways I try to distance that a little bit, but yet still stay true to this idea of a biography, or at least a fictionalized biography, is in my research I discovered that Melville's family name was actually spelled without an E. It was originally, Melville was just the Melvill. And so, for my book, I named my main character, Melville without an E. And so that puts a little bit of distance in there. And then I also try to write in a very contemporary sort of style, opposed to Melville's 19th century, very grandiose sort of style. And so kind of distance it in that way as well. And and so I think that I've come up with a story that definitely is true to Melville's experience, but yet not exactly like reading just a straightforward biography of Melville at the same time.
I see. Got a couple other works in progress?
Right. Well, at least we're trying to find publishers in progress. Yeah, I finished a long novel last summer, which I'm calling An Untimely Frost, in spite of the fact it kind of continues that winter thing. We have to get out of that. But that actually was inspired by I guess it's almost a rumor that when Washington Irving of Sleepy Hollow fame, was touring England in the early part of the 19th century, he actually met and courted Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. And the rumor has it that he actually fell in love with her and proposed to her, but she didn't accept his proposal of marriage because she wanted to stay Mary Shelley. And but that's about all we know. And again, it may not even be true. But just based on that rumor, I thought, well, what would happen if you got those two people together in this sort of romantic, setting or environment or whatever. And so I didn't exactly write about Washington Irving and Mary Shelley, but rather use them as kind of inspiration. So that novel is based on that idea. Again, it's just, it's finished, the manuscript is finished, just kind of waiting for publisher sort of situation. And then also this summer, I'm going to be writing actually a scholarly monograph on Beowulf, to kind of get back to that side of my writing life a little bit. And I'm looking forward to that, although I've been enjoying the focusing on creative writing. But I'm hoping in maybe 3 or 4 months I can knock out this other manuscript, this Beowulf manuscript, and then I can get on to some other creative writing or whatever. But I kind of get these ideas lodged in my head, and the only way to get rid of them is just to write whatever that idea is. And I've had this idea for this Beowulf book for at least a couple of years now, and I've wanted to do something with it. And then I got an opportunity. I talked to an editor for a scholarly publisher, and they were interested in the idea and have kind of let me go for it. So I'll go ahead and spend, like I said, the next few months working on that, and that'll maybe get my creative writing, battery time to recharge a little bit too, so I can head back into that venue once this book is done.
Okay. You're talking about approaching Weeping with an Ancient God from a more, in a more contemporary voice than Melville's kind of, verbose style. Is the setting more contemporary? Is the focus or the character more contemporary?
Well, it may be more contemporary in the sense that being, living here now in this time period, I've got obviously whatever perspective. But I think what I was trying to do is take away some of that that Victorian era lens that we often see 19th century literature through, and what really would have been Melville's thoughts and opinions being thrust into this world, and not have it filtered through that 19th century sort of prim and proper Victorian lens. So I write about things in Weeping with an Ancient God in terms of the main character's perspective and desires and so forth in a way that I can do in this time period, which Melville couldn't have done in his time period. It was provocative when he wrote about these natives in 1842, but 1845 probably by the time the actual book came out. But it certainly wouldn't seem provocative to us. So I've used the license of writing today to write maybe what Melville would have written about had he been able to get away with it in 1845 or whatever. Because one can imagine that he was a real live human being and had a lot of the same ideas and thoughts that a contemporary person today would have. It's just that he didn't have the license, and it just wasn't customary to write about those sorts of things in 1845. So I've used my freedom of voice or whatever to speak about some of those things that maybe he couldn't have back then.
Okay. To make it more real to a degree. I mean,
I hope so. I hope so. I hope it is true to what he may have actually been thinking, and in terms of his fears and his aspirations and those kinds of things. Again, I did do quite a bit of research on Melville, and read a lot of biographical material and tried to integrate that into the text, even though temporally it takes place in this short amount of time in July 1842, just as his own cannibal adventure took place. But I through flashback and through his kind of internal monologue or whatever, I talk about his childhood and some of his failings that he took to sea, because a lot of the other things that he had tried just fell flat in terms of being a school teacher, being a farmer, and those kinds of things. And so I worked that into the narrative, again, in spite of the fact it really takes place in this pretty narrow window in 1842.
okay. And it's being, I guess, packaged with a number of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any, do you thematically tie the novella together with the short stories?
Right. I didn't. Again, these are all stories that have appeared other places. Actually, I've written them over the course of several years. And normally when you do a collection, it's considered appropriate to try to make them sort of thematically connected. But I really wanted to publish the novella, which hasn't been published before. Obviously, there was a section that was published in a journal, but it, as a book, it's only like I said, 100 and some manuscript pages, so it'd probably only be 100 and some roughly book pages as well. And so there's actually some sort of space in there. And so I thought, well, maybe it would be a good place, a good opportunity to bring together some of these short stories which have been published in really obscure literary journals in some cases, so they're kind of hard to come by. And then in other cases, they were published online, and so they've never really had a print life. And I guess there's something, I'm enough of a traditionalist that on the one hand I appreciate the electronic media, and the medium of online publishing, because it can get to such a wide audience and so forth. But yet there's something about me, I'd still like to see it in print. So this will give me an opportunity to kind of bring some stories together into one place that otherwise either they couldn't be found at all because they're, like I said, in such obscure publications to begin with, or they're at least in a print format, a traditional print format for the first time.
Thank you very much for talking with us today. Is there anything you'd like to add or say?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the books, and I appreciate your questions. It's always good to talk to somebody who actually has read the material and has some good questions to bring up about it.